The dusty streets of Millbrook, Texas had seen their share of peculiar characters, but none quite like the man who rode into town that scorching August afternoon in 1887. What made him different wasn't just the black burlap sack tied securely over his head, or the way his horse seemed to guide itself through the bustling main street. It was what happened when the townspeople made him an offer that would change everything, an offer that revealed a truth so shocking it would haunt Millbrook for generations to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clayton Marshall had been riding for 3 days straight when the outline of Millbrook finally appeared through the heat waves, dancing across the horizon. His throat felt like sandpaper, and his horse, Duchess, was breathing heavily beneath him. The black sack covering his head had grown damp with sweat, but he dared not remove it. Not yet. Not until he was certain he'd found what he was looking for. The accident had happened 6 months earlier at his family's ranch outside of San Antonio. Clayton had been breaking in a particularly stubborn Mustang when something spooked the animal. The horse reared back, and Clayton's head struck a wooden post with such force that when he awoke 3 days later, the world had gone completely dark. The doctor said it was permanent. The blow had damaged something deep inside his brain that no amount of medicine could fix. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 2 weeks after the accident, when Clayton discovered that losing his sight had given him something else entirely. Something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the world around him. It started small. He would sense things that weren't there, or rather, things that others claimed weren't there. Shadows that moved independently of their sources, whispers in empty rooms. The feeling of being watched by eyes that belonged to no living person. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, trying to compensate for his lost vision. But as the weeks passed, the phenomena grew stronger, more distinct, more impossible to ignore. The breaking point came on a moonless night in March. Clayton had been sitting on his porch when he heard his deceased father's voice calling his name from the old barn. The voice was as clear as if Thomas Marshall were standing right beside him. Clayton had stumbled through the darkness following the sound, until he found himself standing in the exact spot where his father had died of a heart attack 5 years earlier. That's when Clayton realized the terrible truth. His blindness had somehow opened his eyes to the world of the dead. The revelation terrified him. He couldn't tell his mother, Sarah, who was already struggling to care for the ranch and her suddenly helpless son. He couldn't confide in his younger brother, Michael, who had his own family to worry about. So Clayton did the only thing he could think of. He covered his head with a burlap sack and left home, hoping that if he couldn't see the living world, maybe the dead world would leave him alone too. It didn't work. Even with the sack covering his face, the spirits found him. They whispered secrets in his ears as he rode through small towns across Texas. They told him about buried treasures and hidden crimes. They revealed the locations of missing persons and the identities of their killers. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be drawn to him like moths to a flame, growing more numerous and more insistent with each passing day. Now, as Duchess carried him down Millbrook's main street, Clayton could hear them again. Dozens of voices, all speaking at once, all demanding his attention. But there was something different about this place. Beneath the cacophony of spirit voices, he could sense something darker, older, and far more dangerous than anything he'd encountered before. The townspeople stared as he passed. Clayton could feel their eyes on him, could hear their whispered conversations about the strange man with the sack over his head. Some laughed, thinking him a fool or a madman. Others watched with suspicion, wondering what kind of person would hide their face in such a manner. "Hey there, stranger," called out a gruff voice from somewhere to his left. "You lost or something?" Clayton pulled gently on Duchess's reins, bringing her to a stop. The voice belonged to a middle-aged man standing outside what smelled like a blacksmith's shop. The scent of hot metal and coal smoke filled the air. "Looking for a place to rest my horse and maybe get some water," Clayton replied, his voice muffled by the burlap. "Well, you've come to the right place," the blacksmith said. His name was Henry Watson, though Clayton had no way of knowing that yet. "We've got a stable just down the way, and Martha's Tavern serves the coldest water this side of the Brazos River. But I gotta ask, what's with the sack?" Clayton had prepared for this question. "Got burned in a fire. Face ain't something people want to see." The lie came easily, but it felt heavy on his conscience. The truth was that his face was unmarked by the accident. The sack served a different purpose entirely. It was his only defense against a world that had become far too visible. "Ah, sorry to hear that, friend," Henry said, his tone softening. "Lot of folks around here understand about scars. We don't judge." As Henry spoke, Clayton became aware of another presence nearby. A woman's voice, barely a whisper, speaking directly into his left ear. "He's lying about something." "The blacksmith. Check his forge tonight." Clayton's blood ran cold. The spirit voices had followed him here, just as they had everywhere else. But this one felt different, urgent, almost desperate. "Much obliged for the directions," Clayton managed to say, urging Duchess forward before the spirit could say anything else. The stable was exactly where Henry had said it would be. The stable master, an elderly man named Jeremiah Pine, helped Clayton dismount and tended to Duchess without asking any questions about the sack. Clayton appreciated the man's discretion, though he could sense Jeremiah's curiosity burning just beneath the surface. "She's a fine horse," Jeremiah observed, running his weathered hands along Duchess's flanks. "Been riding hard, though. She could use a good brushing and some oats." "Take good care of her," Clayton said, pressing a silver dollar into the old man's palm. "She's all I got left." Martha's Tavern was a short walk from the stable, and Clayton found his way there by following the sounds of conversation and clinking glasses. The building was larger than he'd expected, with a wide front porch and what felt like a dozen tables scattered throughout the main room. The moment he stepped inside, the spirit voices grew louder. So loud, in fact, that Clayton had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. The dead were everywhere in this place, more concentrated than anywhere he'd been before. Men, women, children, all speaking at once, all trying to tell him something important. "Can I help you, mister?" A woman's voice cut through the supernatural cacophony. This one was definitely alive, warm, breathing, with a slight Texas drawl. "Just looking for some water and maybe a bite to eat," Clayton said. "Well, you've come to the right place. I'm Martha Kellerman, and this is my establishment. Find yourself a seat anywhere you like." Clayton made his way carefully to an empty table near what he hoped was a wall. The voices of the dead continued their relentless chatter, but he was beginning to pick out individual words and phrases: murder, hidden, basement, gold, sheriff, danger. "Here's your water," Martha said, setting the glass down in front of him. "And I've got some fresh beef stew if you're interested." "Can I ask?" She paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase her question. "The sack?" Clayton finished for her. "Got burned. Don't want to frighten folks." "Honey, we've all got our scars," Martha said kindly. "Some are just more visible than others. But if it makes you comfortable, you wear whatever you need to wear." As Martha walked away, another spirit voice whispered in Clayton's ear, "She knows about the basement." They all know, but they're too scared to talk. Clayton's hand trembled as he reached for his water glass. Whatever was happening in Millbrook, it involved more than just the usual small-town secrets. The dead were trying to warn him about something, and their urgency was growing by the minute. The tavern door opened, and Clayton heard the heavy footsteps of someone entering. The conversation in the room died down noticeably, and even the spirit voices seemed to quiet themselves. "Evening, Sheriff," Martha called out, though her voice had lost some of its earlier warmth. "Martha," came the reply. The voice was deep, authoritative, and carried an undertone that made Clayton's skin crawl. "I hear we've got a visitor." Clayton sensed the man approaching his table, felt the weight of his gaze even through the burlap sack. "You must be the fellow with the interesting headwear," the sheriff said. "I'm Sheriff Frank Dalton. Like to know who's passing through my town." "Clayton Marshall," he replied. "Just traveling through, looking for work." "Work, eh? What kind of work does a man with a sack over his head do?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Clayton could feel the tension in the room, could sense that this conversation was about more than just routine questions for a stranger. Ranch work mostly, breaking horses, mending fences. Hands don't need eyes for that kind of work. Sheriff Dalton was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Funny thing about hands. They can tell you a lot about a man. Mind if I take a look at yours?" Clayton hesitated. His hands were calloused from years of ranch work, but they were also unmarked by the burns he'd claimed had damaged his face. Still, he couldn't think of a reason to refuse without arousing more suspicion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He placed his hands palm down on the table. Sheriff Dalton studied them carefully, and Clayton could practically feel the man's suspicion growing. "Interesting," the sheriff said finally. "For a man who's been burned, your hands are remarkably clean. No scars, no signs of fire damage." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the spirit voices had stopped their chattering, as if they too were waiting to see what would happen next. "Fire didn't reach my hands," Clayton said, keeping his voice steady. "Was wearing gloves." "Lucky man," Sheriff Dalton said, but there was no belief in his voice. "Tell me, Mr. Marshall, how long were you planning on staying in Millbrook?" "Just long enough to rest my horse and resupply. Maybe a day or two." "Good," the sheriff said. "Because we're a peaceful town here, and we like to keep it that way. Don't much care for troublemakers or folks who aren't what they seem to be." As Sheriff Dalton's footsteps retreated toward the door, the spirit voices returned with a vengeance. But now they were all saying the same thing, over and over. "Don't trust him. Don't trust any of them. Get out while you can." Clayton sat in the tavern for another hour, nursing his water and trying to make sense of what he'd stumbled into. The dead were clearly trying to warn him about something, but their messages were fragmented and confusing. What he did know was that Millbrook harbored secrets dark enough to trap dozens of spirits, and that Sheriff Dalton was somehow connected to whatever was keeping them here. As the evening wore on, the tavern began to empty. Martha approached his table one more time, refilling his water glass without being asked. "You seem like a decent man," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "If I were you, I'd move on first thing in the morning. This town... it's not what it appears to be." Before Clayton could ask what she meant, Martha had moved away, busying herself with cleaning tables and avoiding his general direction. Clayton made his way back to the stable as the sun began to set. Jeremiah had bedded Duchess down for the night and assured him that the horse would be ready to travel by morning. Clayton paid for a spot in the hayloft, grateful for a place to rest even if sleep seemed unlikely. As he lay in the darkness, listening to the gentle sounds of horses moving in their stalls below, the spirit voices returned once more. But this time, instead of fragmentary warnings, they began to tell him a story. A story about gold and greed, about murder and cover-ups, about a town that had sold its soul for prosperity. And as the night deepened, Clayton began to understand that his arrival in Millbrook was no accident. The dead had been calling him here, drawing him across hundreds of miles of Texas countryside for a reason. They needed him to see what the living refused to acknowledge. They needed him to uncover the truth about what lay hidden beneath Millbrook's peaceful facade. The question was, would he have the courage to remove the sack and see what his cursed gift would reveal? Clayton woke before dawn to the sound of whispered arguments. At first, he thought it was the stable hands starting their morning routines. But as consciousness fully returned, he realized the voices were coming from below, and they weren't among the living. 3 distinct spirits stood near Duchess's stall. Their ethereal forms invisible to normal eyes, but crystal clear to Clayton's supernatural sight. Even through the burlap sack, he could make out their general shapes. 2 men and a woman, all wearing clothes from decades past. "He's the one," the woman was saying. Her voice carried the distinctive accent of someone from back east. "He has to be. No living person has been able to hear us this clearly since Rebecca," one of the men interrupted. "And look what happened to her." Clayton sat up slowly, trying not to make any noise that might alert Jeremiah below. The old stable master was already moving around, preparing for the day's work, but he seemed oblivious to the supernatural conversation taking place just feet away from him. "Who's Rebecca?" Clayton whispered, so quietly that even he could barely hear his own words. The 3 spirits turned toward him in unison, their translucent faces filled with a mixture of hope and terror. "You can see us," the woman breathed. "Dear God, you can actually see us." The larger of the 2 men stepped forward. He wore a Union Army uniform, suggesting he'd died during or shortly after the Civil War. "Rebecca was like you. She could see. U.S., talk to us. She tried to help, tried to expose what Sheriff Dalton and his men were doing. They killed her for it." Clayton's blood ran cold. "When?" 3 years ago," the woman replied. She was a schoolteacher from Austin, passing through town on her way to California. She lasted exactly 4 days after she started asking questions about the missing gold shipments. The second man, dressed in the simple clothes of a farmer, nodded grimly. "They made it look like an accident. The horse threw her, they said. Broke her neck, but we saw what really happened. Sheriff Dalton and his deputy cornered her on the road outside town." Clayton's mind raced. If these spirits were telling the truth, then he was walking into the same trap that had claimed Rebecca's life. But unlike her, he had an advantage. He knew what he was dealing with before it was too late. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. The woman smiled, tears streaming down her spectral cheeks. "The basement under the bank. That's where they keep the gold they've been stealing from wagon trains for the past 5 years. Sheriff Dalton leads a gang of outlaws, but to the rest of the world, he's just a lawman protecting his town." "There's more," the Union soldier added. "Bodies, dozens of them. Every person who's ever gotten too close to the truth ends up down there. Rebecca's body is there too, along with the real Sheriff Dalton." Clayton felt sick. "The real sheriff?" "Frank Dalton isn't his real name," the farmer explained. "His name is Marcus Finch, and he's wanted for murder in 3 states. He killed the real Sheriff Dalton 2 years ago and took his place. The town council knows, but they don't care. The stolen gold has made them all rich." The implications hit Clayton like a physical blow. Millbrook wasn't just harboring criminals. The entire town was built on a foundation of murder and theft. And everyone in positions of power was complicit. "The bank opens at 9, the woman said urgently. "But Dalton and his men move the gold at night, when the streets are empty. If you're going to expose them, you need proof. Real, tangible evidence that the living world can't ignore." "How do I get into the basement?" "There's a hidden entrance," the soldier replied. "Behind the building, where they used to store ice. The door's been bricked over, but the mortar is new. A strong man with the right tools could break through." Clayton nodded, his mind already forming a plan. But first, he needed to understand exactly who he was dealing with. "How many men does Dalton have?" 6 that we've seen," the farmer said, "plus maybe a dozen townspeople who help when needed. The banker, Charles Rothschild, is his right-hand man. The doctor, William Hayes, helps dispose of the bodies. Even Martha at the tavern knows what's happening. though she's not involved in the killing. That explained Martha's warning the night before. She might not be a murderer, but she was certainly an accessory to murder. Clayton spent the next hour listening to the spirits tell him everything they knew about Dalton's operation. The gang targeted wealthy travelers and merchant wagons, using their knowledge of the local roads to set up ambushes in remote locations. The stolen goods were brought back to Millbrook under cover of darkness and stored in the bank's basement until they could be transported to buyers in Mexico. The system was nearly perfect. Dalton's reputation as a sheriff provided the perfect cover, and any lawmen who came looking for missing persons or stolen goods were told that the roads around Millbrook were particularly dangerous, advice that usually sent them looking elsewhere. As the sun rose higher, Clayton made his decision. He would wait until nightfall, then attempt to gather the evidence he needed to expose Dalton's operation. But first, he needed to play the role of an innocent traveler for one more day. Jeremiah appeared at the bottom of the ladder leading to the hayloft. "You awake up there, mister? Got your horse ready if you're planning to move on today?" "Actually," Clayton called down, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about work. Might stick around for a few days if there's anything that needs doing." The old stable master climbed halfway up the ladder, his weathered face creased with concern. "You sure about that? This town? Well, let's just say it's not always friendly to strangers who stay too long." "I can handle myself," Clayton replied, though privately he wondered if that was true. "Suit yourself," Jeremiah said, but his tone suggested he thought Clayton was making a serious mistake. "Just remember, if things get uncomfortable, you can always saddle up and ride out. No shame in that." Clayton spent the morning walking around Millbrook, ostensibly looking for work, but actually mapping out the town's layout. The bank was a substantial brick building on Main Street, with large windows facing the street and what appeared to be solid walls on the other three sides. Behind it, just as the spirits had described, was a small courtyard where an ice house had once stood. The hidden entrance was exactly where they'd said it would be. Clayton ran his hands over the brick wall and found a section where the mortar was noticeably newer and softer than the surrounding area. With the right tools, he could definitely break through, but getting those tools without arousing suspicion would be tricky. His solution came from an unexpected source. While examining the back of the bank, Clayton heard footsteps approaching from the alley. He quickly moved away from the wall and pretended to be examining a loose board on a nearby fence. "Looking for work, stranger?" The voice belonged to a young man, maybe 20 years old, with calloused hands and the kind of lean build that came from hard physical labor. "That's right," Clayton replied. "Name's Clayton Marshall." "Billy Thompson," the young man said. "I do odd jobs around town, carpentry, repairs, that sort of thing. Always looking for help if you're interested." This was perfect. Working with Billy would give Clayton access to tools and a legitimate reason to be moving around town after dark. "What kind of work?" Clayton asked. "Tonight I'm supposed to fix a loose shutter on the schoolhouse," Billy said. "Pays not much, but it's honest work. And Mrs. Henderson always makes sure we get fed." Clayton accepted the job, and they arranged to meet at the schoolhouse just after sunset. This would give Clayton the perfect cover for being out after dark, and Billy's toolbox would provide everything he needed to break through the brick wall. The rest of the day passed slowly. Clayton returned to Martha's Tavern for lunch, where he was treated with polite but distant courtesy by the other patrons. Word had clearly spread about the stranger with the sack over his head, and while no one was openly hostile, he could feel their suspicion like a weight pressing down on him. Sheriff Dalton appeared again during the afternoon, making his rounds with the casual confidence of a man who owned the town. He stopped at Clayton's table briefly, just long enough to make it clear that he was being watched. "Decided to stick around, I see," Dalton said. "Found some work," Clayton replied. "Nothing wrong with an honest day's labor." "No," the sheriff agreed. Nothing wrong with that at all. Just make sure you keep your nose clean, Mr. Marshall. We don't tolerate troublemakers here. As evening approached, Clayton met Billy at the schoolhouse as planned. The young man had brought a comprehensive set of tools, including a heavy sledgehammer that would be perfect for Clayton's purposes. "This shouldn't take more than an hour," Billy said, examining the loose shutter. "Wood's just warped from the heat. Need to plane it down and reset the hinges." Clayton helped hold the shutter while Billy worked, but his attention was focused on memorizing the weight and feel of the tools. When the time came, he would need to work quickly and quietly. The job was finished just as the church bell chimed 9 o'clock. Billy packed up his tools and headed home, leaving Clayton to make his way back toward the center of town. But instead of returning to the stable, he circled around behind the buildings until he reached the alley behind the bank. The spirits were waiting for him. "Are you sure about this?" the woman asked. "If they catch you ... They won't," Clayton said with more confidence than he felt. "How long do I have before Dalton makes his rounds back here?" "He usually checks the bank around midnight," the soldier replied. "But he's unpredictable. Sometimes he comes earlier." Clayton nodded and approached the brick wall. Using a heavy chisel he borrowed from Billy's toolbox, he began working at the mortar around one of the newer bricks. The work was harder than he'd expected, and the sound of metal striking stone seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. After 20 minutes of careful work, he'd loosened enough bricks to create a hole large enough to squeeze through. Beyond was a narrow passage that led down into darkness. "There's a lamp just inside," the farmer's spirit whispered. "Dalton keeps it there for when he needs to check on things." Clayton found the lamp and struck a match. The flame illuminated a stone staircase leading down into what had once been the bank's storage cellar. But what he saw when he reached the bottom made his blood run cold. The basement had been converted into a charnel house. Bodies were stacked along the walls like cordwood, some still wearing the clothes they'd died in. The smell was overwhelming, even through the burlap sack covering his nose and mouth. In the center of the room, wooden crates were piled high, and when Clayton pried one open, he found it filled with gold coins and jewelry. But it was what he found in the far corner that made him truly understand the scope of Dalton's operation. Rebecca's body was there, just as the spirits had said. But she wasn't alone. Next to her lay a man in a sheriff's uniform, the real Sheriff Dalton, with a bullet hole in his forehead. Clayton was so focused on documenting what he'd found that he almost missed the sound of footsteps on the stairs behind him. Well, came Sheriff Dalton's voice from the darkness. "Looks like we've got ourselves another curious visitor." Clayton spun around to find himself facing not just Dalton, but 2 other men as well. All 3 had guns drawn, and there was nowhere to run. "I have to admit," Dalton continued, stepping into the lamplight, "I'm impressed. Most people don't make it this far. But then again, most people can't see in the dark like you seem to be able to." Clayton's mind raced. How much did Dalton know about his abilities? And more importantly, was there any way out of this situation alive? "Nothing to say?" Dalton asked. "That's fine. We'll have plenty of time to talk once we get you properly secured. Boys, tie him up. Looks like we've got ourselves a new addition to the collection." As the 2 men moved toward him, Clayton made a desperate decision. He reached up and tore the burlap sack from his head, revealing his face for the first time since arriving in Millbrook. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every spirit in the basement, and there were dozens of them, suddenly became visible to everyone in the room. The air filled with the ghostly forms of Dalton's victims, all of them pointing accusingly at their killer. Dalton's men screamed and dropped their weapons, stumbling backward in terror. But Dalton himself just smiled. "Interesting trick," he said, raising his gun toward Clayton's head. "But it won't save you." The shot echoed through the basement like thunder, but when the smoke cleared, it wasn't Clayton who lay bleeding on the stone floor. Blood pooled beneath. Deputy Jake Morrison's motionless body as his own gun smoked in his hand. In the chaos of seeing dozens of vengeful spirits materialize before his eyes, he'd pulled the trigger reflexively, but his terror had sent the bullet straight into his own chest instead of Clayton's. The second deputy, Pete Warren, was pressed against the far wall, his face white as bone, eyes wide with shock. The spirits of Dalton's victims surrounded him, their ghostly hands reaching out as if to drag him into their eternal torment. But Sheriff Dalton, or Marcus Finch, as Clayton now knew him to be, stood unmoved in the center of the supernatural storm. His gun remained steady, pointed directly at Clayton's heart. "Well, I'll be damned," Dalton said, his voice carrying an odd note of admiration. "You're one of them freaks, aren't you? Like that schoolteacher woman. She tried the same parlor trick before I put a bullet in her brain." Clayton's newly uncovered eyes took in details that his other senses had missed. Dalton's face was scarred by smallpox, and his left hand was missing 2 fingers, injuries that would have made him easily identifiable to any law enforcement agency looking for Marcus Finch. "The difference is," Dalton continued, "I've been dealing with ghosts for a lot longer than you might think. See, killing folks tends to create them, and after you've murdered enough people, you start to notice patterns. The spirits around the room began to wail a sound that only Clayton could hear clearly, though the others seemed to sense something was wrong. Their ghostly forms flickered and wavered, as if something was interfering with their manifestation. "Iron," Dalton said, noting Clayton's confusion. "Bullets made with iron from a graveyard. Took me a while to figure it out, but turns out there's ways to keep the dead from interfering with the living. Old Martha's grandmother taught me that particular trick before I had to kill her too." Clayton's supernatural sight revealed something horrifying. Dalton wore a necklace of iron beads, each one glowing with a sickly green light that seemed to repel the spirits around him. More disturbing still, Clayton could see faint chains extending from each bead to various spirits in the room. Dalton wasn't just protecting himself from the dead, he was controlling them. "You're wondering how I keep them in line," Dalton observed. "Truth is, ghosts are just like living folks in some ways. They can be threatened, bargained with, even enslaved if you know the right techniques. These iron beads, they're not just protection, they're leashes." The woman's spirit who'd first spoken to Clayton tried to move toward Dalton, but the glowing chain attached to her held her back like an invisible rope. Her face was twisted with rage and frustration. "Took me 3 years to learn how to bind Rebecca's spirit," Dalton said casually. "She was powerful like you. But everyone breaks eventually, even the dead. Now she tells me when folks like you come to town. Helps me prepare for visitors with special talents." Clayton felt sick as the truth became clear. Rebecca hadn't been trying to help him, she'd been forced to lure him to Millbrook. Her warnings about Dalton had been genuine, but they'd also served to bring Clayton exactly where the corrupt sheriff wanted him. "Why?" Clayton managed to ask. "Why go through all this trouble?" Dalton smiled, revealing teeth stained yellow by tobacco. "Because folks like you are valuable, boy. There's people back east who pay top dollar for someone who can see the dead. Rich folks who want to talk to their dearly departed, or who need help finding hidden wills and buried treasures. You're worth more alive than dead, at least for now." The deputy against the wall whimpered as a spirit reached through his body, causing him to convulse with unnatural cold. "Boss," he gasped, "can we please get out of here? This place gives me crawls." "Shut up, Pete," Dalton snapped. "We're conducting business here." Clayton's mind raced through his options. The gun in Dalton's hand was steady, and there was no way to reach him before he could fire. The spirits were restrained by whatever dark magic bound them to those iron beads, and even if Clayton could somehow escape the basement, where would he go? The entire town was complicit in Dalton's crimes, but then Clayton noticed something that gave him hope. Not all the spirits in the basement were bound by chains. The 3 who'd first approached him, the Union soldier, The farmer and the Eastern woman moved freely around the room. More importantly, they were positioning themselves behind Dalton and his remaining deputy. You know what the funny thing is? Dalton continued, apparently enjoying his monologue. This whole operation started by accident. I was just planning to rob a few wagons and move on. But when I killed the real Sheriff Dalton, his ghost showed up and started causing problems. Had to learn how to deal with him quick, or he would have exposed me for sure. The free spirits were moving closer now, and Clayton realized they were waiting for some kind of signal from him. He needed to keep Dalton talking while they got into position. How many people have you killed? Clayton asked. Lost count after. 50, Dalton replied with disturbing pride. Started keeping trophies instead. You want to see them? Got a whole collection upstairs in the sheriff's office. That's enough talking, Deputy Warren said nervously. Let's just shoot him and get out of here. This place is cursed. Dalton laughed. Cursed? Boy, I'm the one doing the cursing. Every soul in this basement belongs to me now. They do what I say, when I say it, for as long as I want them to. That's when Clayton realized Dalton's weakness. The corrupt sheriff was so confident in his control over the spirits that he'd grown careless. He didn't realize that some of them had never been bound in the first place. Clayton caught the Union soldier's ghostly eye and nodded slightly. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds. The soldier materialized fully, becoming visible to everyone in the room as he stepped through the wall behind Dalton. At the same time, the farmer's spirit emerged from the floor directly beneath Deputy Warren, causing the man to stumble backward in terror. Dalton spun toward the soldier, his gun tracking the new threat. But the Eastern woman's spirit had already positioned herself between Clayton and the sheriff. When Dalton fired, the bullet passed harmlessly through her ghostly form and struck the stone wall behind Clayton. Clayton lunged forward, tackling Dalton around the waist and driving him to the ground. The iron necklace scattered across the basement floor, its beads rolling into the shadows and taking their sickly green glow with them. The effect on the bound spirits was immediate and dramatic. Freed from their supernatural chains, dozens of ghostly figures surged toward their former captor with centuries of accumulated rage. No, Dalton screamed, trying to scramble away from the approaching spirits. You can't, I control you. But his power over the dead had been broken. Rebecca's spirit was the first to reach him, her ghostly hands passing through his body and causing him to convulse with supernatural cold. Others followed, each contact draining more life from the murderess. Sheriff. Deputy Warren had fled up the stairs, his terrified screams echoing through the night as he ran. Clayton could hear doors slamming and voices shouting as the deputy's panicked flight woke half the town. Within minutes, Dalton was unconscious, his body temperature dropping to dangerous levels as the spirits took their revenge. Clayton found himself alone in the basement with dozens of corpses and an equal number of grateful ghosts. Thank you, Rebecca's spirit whispered, her voice finally free of the compulsion that had forced her to serve her killer. We can rest now. Not yet, Clayton replied. First we need to make sure the living world knows what happened here. These people, he gestured toward the stacked bodies, deserve justice. The Union soldier nodded approvingly. What do you need us to do? Help. And me gather evidence, Clayton said. Documents, anything that proves what Dalton and his gang have been doing. And we need to get word to the real law enforcement, the Texas Rangers, the federal marshals, anyone who can clean up this mess. Clayton spent the next hour searching the basement and the sheriff's office above. The spirits guided him to hidden compartments and secret documents that revealed the full scope of the operation. Dalton had kept meticulous records of every robbery, every murder, every bribe paid to corrupt officials. More disturbing still were the letters from wealthy clients back east, people who had paid Dalton substantial sums for the services of gifted individuals like Rebecca. The trade in people with supernatural abilities was apparently more extensive than Clayton had imagined. As dawn broke over Millbrook, Clayton found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could take the evidence he'd gathered and disappear, leaving others to clean up the mess. Or he could stay and face the consequences of what he'd uncovered. The decision was made for him when he heard horses approaching from the east. A lot of horses, moving fast. Texas Rangers. The farmer's spirit informed him. Deputy Warren rode all night to reach them. Told them some wild story about ghosts and murders. Clayton looked down at the unconscious form of Marcus Finch, then at the basement full of evidence. Whatever happened next, the truth was going to come out. The only question was whether anyone would believe it. He walked outside to meet the approaching lawman, his face uncovered for the first time in months. Behind him, the spirits of Millbrook began to fade as the sunrise brought them the peace they'd been denied for so long. But Clayton's ordeal was far from over. As the lead ranger dismounted and approached him, Clayton realized that proving his innocence would be almost as difficult as surviving Dalton's trap had been. "You Clayton Marshall?" the ranger asked, his hand resting on his gun. "I am." "You're under arrest for the murders of Sheriff Frank Dalton and Deputy Jake Morrison." "You have the right to." "Sheriff Dalton isn't dead," Clayton interrupted. "And he isn't who you think he is. His real name is Marcus Finch, and he's wanted for murder in 3 states. The ranger's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious accusation, son. You got any proof to back it up?" Clayton smiled grimly and gestured toward the bank building behind him. "More proof than you can handle, Ranger. But you might want to bring some strong stomachs. What's down in that basement is going to make some folks sick." As the Rangers spread out to secure the scene, Clayton caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the shadows near Martha's Tavern. It was Billy Thompson, the young carpenter who'd unknowingly provided the tools that made this night possible. But Billy wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a woman Clayton had never seen before, a woman whose translucent form was visible only to his supernatural sight. Another spirit. Another ghost with unfinished business. Clayton sighed and walked toward them, already knowing that his work in Millbrook wasn't finished yet. The town's supernatural problems ran deeper than just Marcus Finch and his iron necklace, much deeper. As he approached Billy and the unknown spirit, Clayton began to understand that removing the burlap sack from his head hadn't just revealed his face to the world. It had announced to every tormented soul within 100 miles that someone who could see them had finally arrived. And they all had stories to tell. The spirit beside Billy Thompson was unlike any Clayton had encountered before. Where the others appeared translucent and ethereal, this woman possessed an almost solid presence, her form crackling with supernatural energy that made the air around her shimmer like heat waves. "Billy," Clayton called out softly, not wanting to startle the young carpenter. "You all right?" Billy turned, his face pale with exhaustion. "Mr. Marshall?" "I heard gunshots and screaming. What happened at the bank?" Clayton glanced at the spirit woman, who was studying him with intense curiosity. Unlike the other ghosts, she seemed fully aware of her supernatural state and completely in control of her manifestation. "It's a long story," Clayton replied. "Right. Now I need to know, have you been seeing things lately? Things that other people can't see?" Billy's eyes widened. "How did you ... I mean, I thought I was going crazy. She showed up 3 days ago, right after you came to town. Keeps trying to tell me something, but I can't understand what she's saying." The spirit woman stepped forward, her voice carrying an urgency that made Clayton's skin crawl. "My name is Victoria Ashford. I was murdered in New Orleans 6 months ago by a man named Cornelius Blackwood. He's here in Millbrook, and he's planning something that will make Marcus Finch's crimes look like child's play." Clayton felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of something?" "Blackwood isn't just a killer," Victoria continued. "He's a practitioner of dark arts, real dark arts, not the simple iron trinkets Finch used. He's been collecting people with abilities like yours, Billy's, and mine. Building an army of the gifted to serve his twisted purposes. Billy looked confused and frightened. What abilities? I don't have any special powers. Victoria's ghostly form flickered with what might have been impatience. You can see me, can't you? That's more than most people can manage. Blackwood calls it the sight, the ability to perceive supernatural entities. It's rarer than you might think and infinitely more valuable. Clayton's mind raced as he processed this information. Are you saying Finch was working for this Blackwood? Not working for, Victoria corrected. Competing with. Blackwood's been systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge his monopoly on supernatural talent. Finch was supposed to be next, but you've complicated things considerably. The conversation was interrupted by Ranger Captain Samuel Torres, approaching with two of his men. The captain was a weathered man in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much violence. Mr. Marshall, Torres said, his tone carefully. Neutral, we've examined the evidence you provided. The basement, the documents, the bodies. It's extensive. And Marcus Finch? Still unconscious but alive. Our doctor says his condition is unusual severe hypothermia despite the warm weather, but no obvious cause. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Clayton chose his words carefully. Finch had some unusual methods for controlling people. Sometimes those methods have unexpected consequences. Torres studied Clayton's face intently. You know, Deputy Warren told us some wild stories about ghosts and supernatural happenings. Normally, I'd dismiss that kind of talk as the ravings of a man in shock, but given what we've found here. What are you asking, Captain? I'm asking if there's anything else we should know about this situation. Anything that might help us understand how one man managed to terrorize an entire town for years without anyone seeking outside help. Before Clayton could answer, a commotion erupted from the direction of the bank. Shouts and the sound of running feet echoed through the morning air. Captain Torres and his men immediately headed toward the disturbance, leaving Clayton alone with Billy and Victoria's spirit. That's him, Victoria said urgently. Blackwood. He's come for Finch. Clayton squinted toward the bank, where a man in expensive black suit was arguing with the rangers guarding the entrance. Even from a distance, there was something unsettling about the newcomer, the way shadows seemed to gather around him despite the bright morning sun, the way people unconsciously stepped back when he spoke. We need to get out of here, Victoria continued. Now, before he realizes what you are, but it was too late. The man in the black suit turned toward them, and even across the distance of Main Street, Clayton could feel the weight of his gaze. Cornelius Blackwood's face was pale and angular, with deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Blackwood began walking toward them with deliberate, measured steps. With each footfall, the temperature around Clayton seemed to drop a degree. Billy, Clayton said quietly, whatever happens, don't look directly at him. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understand? The young carpenter nodded, though his confusion was evident. What's going on? Who is that man? Someone very dangerous, Clayton replied. Someone who's been looking for people like us. As Blackwood approached, Victoria's spirit form began to flicker and fade. He's suppressing my manifestation, she said, her voice growing weak. Clayton, you have to stop him. He has dozens of people imprisoned in New Orleans, gifted individuals he's turned into slaves. If he captures you. Her voice trailed off as her form disappeared entirely, leaving Clayton and Billy alone to face whatever Cornelius Blackwood had planned. Gentlemen, Blackwood said as he drew near, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been European. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Cornelius Blackwood, a consultant specializing in unusual criminal cases. I've come to assist the Texas Rangers with their investigation. Clayton noticed that despite Blackwood's pleasant words, The man's shadow fell wrong, stretching in directions that didn't match the sun's position, and seeming to move independently of its caster. "That's very civic-minded of you," Clayton replied. "Carefully, though I'm not sure what kind of consulting this case requires." Blackwood smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "Oh, I think you'd be surprised. Cases involving supernatural elements require specialized knowledge. For instance, did you know that certain individuals possess the ability to see and interact with spiritual entities? Fascinating stuff, really." Billy shifted nervously beside Clayton, clearly sensing the menace beneath Blackwood's polite facade. "I wouldn't know anything about that," Clayton said. "Of course not," Blackwood agreed. "Though I must say you have an interesting collection of spiritual attachments following you around. Most people would find that ... Clayton's blood ran cold. Not only could Blackwood see the spirits, but he was apparently powerful enough to track their movements even when they weren't manifesting visibly. "I'm afraid I don't follow," Clayton said. Though his hand instinctively moved toward the gun at his hip, Blackwood's smile widened. "Please, Mr. Marshall, let's not insult each other's intelligence. You're clearly a man of considerable talent, and I'm always interested in meeting others who share my ... specialized interests. What do you want?" "Direct. I appreciate that. What I want is to offer you an opportunity. A chance to put your abilities to profitable use, rather than wasting them on thankless heroics like this morning's adventure." Clayton's supernatural sight revealed more disturbing details about Blackwood. Dark energy swirled around the man like smoke, and faint screams seemed to echo from somewhere within his shadow. Most unsettling of all, Clayton could see chains of crackling darkness extending from Blackwood's body and disappearing into the distance connections to other supernatural entities under his control. "Not interested," Clayton said firmly. "I think you should reconsider," Blackwood replied, his tone remaining pleasant even as his eyes turned cold. "You see, I've made substantial investments in this region. Marcus Finch was just one of several ... business partners I've cultivated over the years. His capture represents a significant loss to my operations. Then maybe you should reconsider your choice of business partners." Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Mr. Marshall, I don't think you understand the situation. This isn't a negotiation, it's an inevitability. People with your talents don't get to choose their own destiny. They serve those with the power to bind them, or they die. There are no other options." Billy stepped backward, finally understanding that he was witnessing something far beyond a normal conversation. "Clayton, I think we should go find those Rangers." "Good idea," Clayton agreed, but as he turned to leave, he found their path blocked by Deputy Warren. The man who'd fled the basement in terror now stood motionless in the street, his eyes blank and his movements unnaturally stiff. "I'm afraid Deputy Warren is currently indisposed," Blackwood said casually. "Weak minds are so easy to influence. It's really quite convenient." More people began emerging from buildings along Main Street, Martha from her tavern, Jeremiah from his stable, shopkeepers and townspeople Clayton had seen throughout his stay in Millbrook. All of them moved with the same blank, puppet-like motions as Deputy Warren. "Impressive, isn't it?" Blackwood observed. "Most of these people have been under my influence for months. Finch thought he was running this town, but I've been pulling the strings from the beginning." Clayton realized with growing horror that Millbrook's corruption ran far deeper than he'd imagined. Finch's operation had been merely the surface layer of something much more sinister. "What do you really want?" Clayton demanded. "What I've always wanted," Blackwood replied. "Control. You see, the world is changing. Mr. Marshall, the age of industry is giving way to something far more interesting, an age where those who understand the supernatural will rule over those who remain blind to it." Billy grabbed Clayton's arm. "We need to get out of here, now." But as they looked around, they realized they were completely surrounded. The controlled townspeople had formed a circle around them, Their blank faces turned inward like a jury of the damned. "I'm building a new kind of empire," Blackwood continued. "One founded not on gold or land, but on supernatural power. Individuals like yourself will form the backbone of this empire willingly or otherwise." Clayton's hand moved to his gun, but Blackwood merely laughed. "Please, Mr. Marshall, physical weapons are so limiting. Allow me to demonstrate something far more effective." Blackwood raised his hand, and the shadows around him began to writhe and expand. But before they could reach Clayton and Billy, a new voice cut through the morning air. "Cornelius Blackwood, you are under arrest for murder, kidnapping, and practicing supernatural arts without a federal license." Everyone turned to see a woman in a long coat approaching from the east end of Main Street. She was tall, with auburn hair and eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Most importantly, she radiated a sense of authority that made even Blackwood pause. "Agent Sarah Whitmore," Blackwood said, his pleasant facade finally cracking. "I should have known the department would send their best bloodhound." "The department?" Clayton whispered to Billy. "Federal Department of Supernatural Investigation," the woman replied, apparently having heard him despite the distance. "We've been tracking Mr. Blackwood's activities across 7 states. Mr. Marshall, Mr. Thompson, please step away from the suspect." Clayton didn't need to be asked twice. He and Billy quickly moved toward Agent Whitmore, though the circle of controlled townspeople made their progress difficult. "Agent Whitmore," Blackwood called out, his voice now carrying an edge of genuine anger. "You're interfering with a lawful business transaction." "There's nothing lawful about enslaving people with supernatural abilities," Whitmore replied. "Now, release your hold on these civilians and surrender peacefully." Blackwood's response was to gesture sharply with both hands. The shadows around him erupted outward like tentacles, reaching for Clayton, Billy, and Agent Whitmore with supernatural speed. What happened next would change Clayton's understanding of his place in the world forever. Agent Whitmore didn't dodge. The attacking shadows, she met them head-on with powers of her own. Light blazed from her hands, pure white energy that cut through Blackwood's darkness like a sword through silk. The supernatural battle that followed shook the very foundations of Millbrook, shattering windows and causing the ground to tremble. And through it all, Clayton realized that his journey was just beginning. The Federal Department of Supernatural Investigation, people with abilities like his own in government service, an entire hidden world of supernatural crime and law, enforcement that he'd never imagined existed. As the battle raged around him, Clayton made a decision that would define the rest of his life. When this was over, he was going to ask Agent Whitmore for a job. The supernatural battle between Agent Whitmore and Cornelius Blackwood turned Main Street into a war zone. Tendrils of living darkness clashed with beams of pure light, their collision sending shockwaves through the air that shattered every piece of glass within a 3-block radius. Clayton grabbed Billy and pulled him behind an overturned wagon as a wave of supernatural energy passed overhead, leaving frost patterns on everything it touched. The controlled townspeople stood motionless in the crossfire, apparently immune to the chaos surrounding them. "What the hell is happening?" Billy shouted over the sound of supernatural forces tearing through the air. "A glimpse of the real world," Clayton replied, watching as Agent Whitmore conjured a shield of blazing light to deflect one of Blackwood's shadow attacks. The world most people never see. Through his supernatural sight, Clayton could perceive the full scope of the battle. Blackwood wasn't just commanding darkness, he was channeling the tortured souls of his victims, using their anguish as fuel for his attacks. Each shadow tendril contained the screaming essence of someone he'd enslaved or murdered. Agent Whitmore's power was different. Her light seemed to come from within, pure and clean, uncontaminated by suffering or death. When her energy struck the shadow souls, Clayton saw them break free from Blackwood's control, their forms dissolving into peaceful light as they finally found release. "You cannot stop what's already begun, Agent," Blackwood called out as he gestured toward the surrounding buildings. My network spans the entire continent. Destroy me here, and 20 others will take my place. Maybe, Whitmore replied, her hands weaving patterns in the air that left trails of golden fire. But that's 20 other cases for 20 other agents. Right now, I'm only concerned with you. One of Blackwood's shadow tendrils suddenly changed direction, reaching not for Agent Whitmore but for Clayton and Billy. Clayton shoved Billy aside and tried to dodge, but the supernatural attack moved faster than any physical threat could. The shadow wrapped around Clayton's leg like a living rope, instantly numbing his limb with cold that burned worse than fire. Through the connection, he could feel Blackwood's presence invading his mind, probing for weaknesses and trying to establish the same kind of control the man exercised over the townspeople. But something unexpected happened. Instead of being overwhelmed by Blackwood's mental assault, Clayton felt his own supernatural abilities surge in response. The spirits he'd freed in the bank basement materialized around him, forming a protective barrier between his consciousness and Blackwood's invasion. Impossible. Blackwood snarled, his concentration wavering. No untrained mind should be able to resist. His words were cut off as Agent Whitmore pressed her advantage, sending a lance of pure light through his chest. The beam didn't physically wound him, but it severed dozens of the dark chains that connected him to his supernatural slaves all across Millbrook. People suddenly straightened and blinked, their eyes clearing as they regained control of their own minds. Deputy Warren stumbled backward, looking around in confusion. Martha fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she remembered everything she'd been forced to do while under Blackwood's influence. You're losing control, Whitmore observed, advancing steadily despite the waves of darkness that Blackwood continued to hurl at her. Your power was always built on stolen foundations. When those foundations crumble... Silence. Blackwood roared, his civilized facade finally cracking completely. His handsome features twisted into something monstrous, and the shadows around him took on distinctly predatory shapes: wolves, serpents, and things that had never been alive at all. But Agent Whitmore was right. With each connection Blackwood lost, his remaining attacks grew weaker and more desperate. Clayton could see the truth through his supernatural sight. The man's power was entirely parasitic, drawn from the suffering of others rather than from any natural source. Victoria Ashford's spirit suddenly rematerialized beside Clayton, her form now crackling with energy. He's vulnerable, she said urgently. The source of his power is an artifact he carries. A black stone that contains the essence of everyone he's ever killed. Destroy it, and you destroy his ability to control the dead. Clayton looked more closely at Blackwood and spotted what Victoria was referring to: a pendant hanging around the man's neck, so dark it seemed to absorb light from its surroundings. Even from a distance, Clayton could sense the malevolent energy radiating from the stone. Agent Whitmore, Clayton called out. The pendant. It's the source of his power. Whitmore's eyes locked onto the target, and her expression hardened with determination. She raised both hands above her head, and the air around her began to shimmer with intense heat. Cornelius Blackwood, she said formally, by the authority vested in me by the Federal Department of Supernatural Investigation, I sentence you to immediate binding and containment. What happened next was unlike anything Clayton had ever witnessed. Agent Whitmore's light condensed into a single, blindingly bright spear that shot toward Blackwood with the speed of lightning. The supernatural criminal tried to dodge, but the spear of light curved through the air like a living thing, striking the black pendant with perfect precision. The stone exploded in a flash of darkness, so intense that it briefly turned day into night. The sound that accompanied its destruction was indescribable, the combined death screams of hundreds of souls, suddenly given voice all at once. Blackwood's own scream joined the chorus as the dark energy that had sustained him for so long was suddenly ripped away. His body convulsed, aged decades in seconds. and collapsed to the dusty street like a broken marionette. The controlled townspeople all around Main Street staggered and fell. But unlike Blackwood, they were simply unconscious. The unnatural cold that had gripped the air dissipated, replaced by the normal warmth of a Texas morning. Clayton helped Billy to his feet as agent. Whitmore approached the fallen form of Cornelius Blackwood. The man was still alive, but barely his. Breathing was shallow, and his once dark hair had turned completely white. "Is it over?" Billy asked, looking around at the devastation. "For now," Whitmore replied, producing a pair of unusual handcuffs that seemed to be made of the same light-absorbing material as Blackwood's destroyed pendant. "Mr. Blackwood will be transported to a specialized containment facility where he can't harm anyone else." Clayton watched as she secured the supernatural criminal. "How many others are there?" "People like him, I mean." "More than you'd think. Fewer than there used to be," Whitmore said. The department was founded in 1823, after a series of supernatural incidents that nearly exposed our hidden world to the general public. We've been working ever since to keep dangerous individuals like Blackwood contained. And people like me? Agent. Whitmore studied Clayton with those strangely glowing eyes. "People like you are exactly why the department exists, Mr. Marshall. Not to control or exploit your abilities, but to help you use them for something worthwhile. To give you a choice that men like Blackwood would never offer." Victoria's spirit appeared beside them again, her form now peaceful and translucent. "Thank you," she said to both Clayton and Whitmore. "All of us who were bound to him. We can finally rest now." "Victoria Ashford," Whitmore said, apparently able to see the spirit as clearly as Clayton could. "I'm sorry we couldn't save you in New Orleans. Your death was what led us to Blackwood's trail. My death wasn't in vain if it helped stop him." Victoria replied, "But there's something else you need to know. Blackwood spoke the truth about his network. This was just one operation among many. There are others, some even more dangerous than he was." Whitmore nodded grimly. "We know. The department has agents working cases across the country. But every criminal we stop, every victim we save, makes the world a little safer for people with supernatural gifts." As if summoned by her words, 3 more people in long coats appeared at the far end of Main Street. They moved with the same purposeful stride as Whitmore, and Clayton could sense supernatural energy radiating from each of them. "Cleanup crew," Whitmore explained. "They'll help the townspeople recover from their ordeal and ensure that none of this becomes public knowledge. The world isn't ready to know about people like us yet." Billy looked confused. "What happens to us? To people who've seen all this?" "You have the same choice Mr. Marshall does," Whitmore said. "You can accept memory modification, a gentle process. That will let you remember this as a more conventional criminal case. Or you can keep your memories and learn to live with the knowledge of what's really out there." "And the third option?" Clayton asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Agent Whitmore smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "The third option is that you come work for us. The department is always looking for talented individuals who want to make a difference. People who've proven they can handle the truth about our world and still choose to do the right thing." Clayton looked around at the aftermath of the battle. The townspeople were beginning to wake up, confusion replacing the blank expressions they'd worn under Blackwood's control. Captain Torres and his rangers were approaching cautiously, clearly, struggling to understand what they'd witnessed. "What would that involve?" Clayton asked. "Training first. Learning to control and enhance your abilities. Then fieldwork cases like this one, but all across the country. It's dangerous work, and it doesn't pay as well as robbing banks or enslaving spirits for rich clients. But it's honest work, and it helps people who can't help themselves." Billy stepped forward. "What about people like me? I mean, I can see spirits sometimes, but I can't do what you two do." "The department needs all kinds of talents," Whitmore assured him. "Investigators, researchers, support staff. Being able to see the supernatural world is valuable even if you can't manipulate it directly. Victoria's spirit began to fade as the sun climbed higher in the sky. "Choose wisely," she said to Clayton. "There are so many others who need someone like you to help them find peace." Clayton thought about everything that had led him to this moment. The accident that had taken his sight, but given him supernatural vision. The months of wandering, trying to escape from spirits who only wanted his help. The revelation that his abilities could be used to fight genuine evil rather than simply endure it. "I need to ask you something," Clayton said to Agent Whitmore. "This ability I have seeing and talking to the dead, am I the only one?" "Not even close," she replied. "There are dozens of people with similar gifts working for the department. Some can see spirits, others can communicate with them. Still others can help them find peace or send them on to whatever comes next. You'd be among friends." Clayton looked at Billy, who was still processing everything he'd witnessed. "What do you think?" "I think," Billy said slowly, "that if I go back to carpentry after this, I'm going to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on you." Clayton smiled the first genuine smile he'd managed since before his accident. "Agent Whitmore, I think you've got yourself 2 new recruits." "Excellent," Whitmore said, producing a pair of silver badges from her coat. "Welcome to the Federal Department of Supernatural Investigation. Your real education starts now." As Clayton pinned the badge to his shirt, he felt a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. The burlap sack that had hidden his face for so long was gone forever, replaced by the knowledge that his abilities and his willingness to help others had value beyond anything he'd imagined. The spirits of Millbrook began to fade as the morning progressed, finally able to rest knowing that justice had been served. But Clayton could sense new presences gathering at the edges of his perception, other lost souls, other victims of supernatural crime, all calling out for someone who could see them and hear their stories. For the first time since his accident, Clayton Marshall looked forward to what tomorrow might bring. The cleanup crew worked efficiently to restore order to Millbrook, their supernatural abilities making quick work of repairing the damage from the battle. Within hours, the town looked almost normal again, if you ignored the fact that half the population was still recovering from months of mental domination. As the sun set over Texas, Clayton found himself sitting on the porch of Martha's Tavern with Billy and Agent Whitmore, planning their journey to the department's training facility in Colorado. "One last question," Clayton said. "That federal license you mentioned when you arrested Blackwood, is that a real thing?" Agent Whitmore's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Let's just say the government takes supernatural crimes very seriously these days. There are laws, regulations, oversight committees, the whole bureaucratic nightmare. You'll learn all about it during training." Clayton laughed, imagining himself filling out paperwork to justify communicating with ghosts. It seemed absurd, but then again, so had everything else that had happened to him lately. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Clayton realized that removing that burlap sack had done more than reveal his face to the world. It had revealed who he was meant to be. 3 weeks later, Clayton found himself standing at the edge of a cliff in the Colorado Rockies, staring down at what appeared to be nothing but empty wilderness. According to Agent Whitmore, the department's training facility was supposedly directly below them, but all Clayton could see through his supernatural sight were trees, rocks, and a family of confused elk. "I don't see anything," Billy said, voicing Clayton's thoughts. The young carpenter had adapted remarkably well to their new circumstances, though he still jumped whenever a spirit materialized without warning. "That's the point," Whitmore replied, pulling a small brass device from her coat pocket. It looked like a compass, but instead of pointing north, its needle swirled in complex patterns that hurt Clayton's eyes to follow. "The facility is hidden behind multiple layers of supernatural concealment. Only authorized personnel can see through the barriers." She pressed a hidden button on the compass, and the world around them shimmered like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The empty wilderness dissolved, revealing a sprawling complex of buildings nestled in a valley that definitely hadn't been there moments before. "Welcome to Camp Supernatural," Whitmore said with obvious pride. "Home to the department's training, academy, research division, and maximum security containment facility." The facility was unlike anything Clayton had expected. Instead of military-style barracks, the buildings were constructed from local stone and timber, blending seamlessly with the natural landscape. Gardens and courtyards connected the various structures, and he could see people of all ages moving between them with purpose. "How many people know about this place?" Clayton asked as they began descending a winding trail toward the main complex. Outside the department? Maybe a dozen high-ranking government officials. Inside the department? About 300 people. Work here at any given time, though our field agents are scattered across the country. As they walked, Clayton became aware of supernatural activity unlike anything he'd encountered before. Spirits moved freely through the complex, but these weren't the tortured souls he'd grown accustomed to seeing. These spirits seemed peaceful, purposeful, as if they were there by choice rather than compulsion. "Are those—" Billy started to ask. "Department spirits," Whitmore confirmed. "Agents who died in the line of duty, but chose to continue serving in their current form. They're invaluable for training purposes and ongoing investigations." One of the spirits, a middle-aged woman in what appeared to be a Civil War-era dress, approached their group. "Agent Whitmore," she said in a voice only Clayton and a few others could hear. "Director Hawthorne would like to see the new recruits immediately." "Thank you, Agent Morrison," Whitmore replied. "We'll head straight to his office." Clayton was struck by the casual professionalism of the interaction. Here, his ability to communicate with the dead wasn't seen as a curse or an oddity. It was simply another tool for getting the job done. The main administration building was larger than it had appeared from above, with high ceilings and wide corridors lined with portraits of department agents dating back nearly a century. Clayton paused before one painting that showed a woman with familiar-looking eyes. "My grandmother," Whitmore said, noticing his interest. Agent Elizabeth Whitmore, one of the department's founding members. She could see the future, not clearly and not always accurately, but enough to help prevent several supernatural disasters. It runs in families, sometimes. About 30% of department personnel have relatives who also possess supernatural abilities. We think there's a hereditary component, but genetics only tells part of the story. Director Hawthorne's office occupied the top floor of the building, with windows offering a panoramic view of the hidden valley. The man himself was younger than Clayton had expected, perhaps 40, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense gaze that suggested he saw more than most people. "Mr. Marshall, Mr. Thompson," Hawthorne said, rising from behind a desk covered with files and strange artifacts. "Welcome to the department. Agent Whitmore speaks very highly of your actions in Millbrook." "Thank you, sir," Clayton replied, though he wasn't sure what protocol applied when meeting the head of a secret government agency. "Please sit," Hawthorne said, gesturing to chairs arranged around a coffee table. "I want to discuss your training program and get a better understanding of your abilities." Clayton and Billy settled into the surprisingly comfortable chairs while Agent Whitmore took a position near the window. Hawthorne remained standing, his attention focused entirely on his new recruits. "Mr. Marshall," he began, Agent Whitmore's report indicates that your supernatural sight manifested after a traumatic head injury. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir. About 7 months ago." "Interesting. Trauma-induced manifestation is relatively rare, but not unheard of. Usually indicates a particularly strong latent ability that required a significant trigger to emerge." Hawthorne made a note on a pad of paper. "And Mr. Thompson, your abilities seem to be developing more gradually?" Billy nodded nervously. I've always seen things that others couldn't, but it's gotten stronger since meeting Clayton. Like being around him somehow amplifies whatever I can do. Proximity enhancement, Hawthorne mused. Also rare, but again, not unprecedented. Some individuals with supernatural abilities seem to strengthen each other when they work together. We call them resonant pairs. Clayton felt a chill. Is that why Blackwood was so interested in collecting people with abilities? To create some kind of supernatural army? Partially, Hawthorne confirmed. But Blackwood's methods were crude and parasitic. He was stealing power rather than cultivating it naturally. The results were impressive in the short term, but ultimately unsustainable. The director moved to his desk and retrieved a thick folder. Which brings me to your training program. Normally, new recruits spend 6 months learning basic supernatural theory, defensive techniques, and department protocols. However, given your recent field experience and the urgency of certain ongoing cases, I'm inclined to accelerate your timeline. What kind of cases? Billy asked. The cleanup from Blackwood's operation has revealed connections to supernatural crime networks across the continent. We've identified at least 12 other individuals with similar operations, and several are significantly more dangerous than Blackwood ever was. Hawthorne opened the folder and spread several photographs across the coffee table. Each showed a different person, but they all shared the same cold, predatory expression Clayton had seen in Blackwood's eyes. These individuals represent the most immediate threats to supernatural security. Some, like Madame Zenobia in San Francisco, specialize in enslaving for wealthy clients. Others, like the Reverend Malachi Cross in New Orleans, use supernatural abilities to build religious cults. And then there's Professor Edmund Thorne in Boston, who's been conducting experiments on people with abilities that make Blackwood's methods look humane. Clayton studied the photographs, memorizing each face. What makes them so dangerous? Power, resources, and most importantly, organization. Unlike Blackwood, who operated largely alone, these individuals have built extensive networks of supernatural criminals. Taking them down will require coordinated efforts by multiple department teams. Agent Whitmore stepped forward. Director, are you suggesting that Marshall and Thompson be assigned to active cases before completing their training? Not assigned, Hawthorne corrected. Embedded. I want them to accompany experienced teams as observers and junior agents. Real-world experience is often more valuable than classroom instruction, and we need every available asset in the field. Clayton felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The prospect of continuing the work they'd started in Millbrook was appealing, but he also knew how close they'd come to disaster during that first case. What about our abilities? He asked. Agent Whitmore mentioned training to control and enhance them. That will happen concurrently with your field assignments, Hawthorne assured him. The department has developed techniques for accelerating supernatural development under controlled conditions. You'll work with instructors who have similar abilities and can guide your progress. A knock at the office door interrupted the conversation. Come in, Hawthorne called. The door opened to reveal a man who looked to be in his 60s, with silver hair and eyes that held the same otherworldly quality as Agent Whitmore's. But where her gaze suggested inner light, his seemed to contain infinite depth, as if he could see through multiple layers of reality simultaneously. Director, the newcomer said, I understand we have new recruits who need evaluation. Ah, perfect timing, Mr. Marshall, Mr. Thompson. I'd like you to meet Professor Gabriel Sterling, our head of supernatural development. Professor Sterling has been with the department for over 30 years and has helped train some of our most effective agents. Professor Sterling approached Clayton first, extending his hand. The moment their skin made contact, Clayton felt a jolt of supernatural energy that made his vision flare with brilliant light. For an instant, he could see not just the spirits that normally surrounded him, but layers of reality extending in all directions, past, present, and multiple possible futures flickering like candle flames. "Remarkable," Sterling said, his voice filled with genuine amazement. "Mr. Marshall, your ability isn't limited to seeing the dead. You have the potential to perceive across multiple dimensional planes. With proper training, you could become one of our most valuable investigators." The professor released Clayton's hand and turned to Billy, offering the same greeting. This time, the reaction was different but equally dramatic. Billy's eyes suddenly blazed with silver light, and Clayton could see supernatural energy radiating from his friend like heat from a forge. "Fascinating," Sterling murmured. "Mr. Thompson, you're what we call a conductor, someone who can channel and amplify the abilities of others. It's an incredibly rare gift, and potentially one of the most powerful." Billy blinked, the silver light fading from his eyes. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Director Hawthorne said with obvious satisfaction, "that you two are going to be very busy over the next few months. Professor Sterling, I want them both in your advanced development program starting tomorrow." "Of course," Sterling agreed. "Though I should warn you, the advanced program is considerably more intensive than our standard training. You'll be working with abilities most people can't even imagine, let alone control." Clayton thought about the spirits who'd guided him in Millbrook, the supernatural battle he'd witnessed, and the network of criminals that still needed to be stopped. "How soon can we start?" Sterling smiled. "I like your attitude. Follow me, and I'll show you what real supernatural training looks like." As they left Hawthorne's office, Clayton caught sight of movement in the corridor below. Teams of agents were moving with obvious urgency, carrying equipment and consulting maps. Whatever case they were preparing for, it was clearly significant. "Professor," Clayton asked as they walked, "how dangerous is this work really?" Sterling was quiet for a moment before answering. "Mr. Marshall, in the past 5 years, the department has lost 23 agents in the line of duty. Some were killed by supernatural criminals, others by the entities they were investigating, and a few by their own abilities when they lost control." The sobering statistics hung in the air as they descended a staircase toward what appeared to be underground levels of the facility. "However," Sterling continued, "in that same period, we've prevented countless supernatural disasters, saved hundreds of innocent lives, and removed dozens of dangerous criminals from circulation. The work is risky, but it's also necessary." They reached a corridor lined with doors bearing unusual symbols instead of room numbers. Sterling stopped before one marked with a spiral that seemed to shift and move when Clayton wasn't looking directly at it. "Your first lesson," Sterling said, placing his hand on the door handle, "is learning to see beyond the obvious. What you perceive as reality is actually just one layer of a much more complex structure. Are you ready to see what lies beneath?" Clayton looked at Billy, who nodded with determination despite his obvious nervousness. Together, they had faced down a supernatural criminal and emerged victorious. Whatever lay behind that door couldn't be worse than what they'd already survived. "We're ready," Clayton said. Sterling opened the door, revealing a room that defied all logic and physics. The space inside was vast, far larger than the building could possibly contain, and filled with floating islands of stone connected by bridges of crystallized light. Spirits moved freely through the air, some teaching classes to groups of students, others practicing supernatural techniques that left trails of energy in their wake. "Welcome," Professor Sterling said, "to your real education." As Clayton stepped into the impossible room, he felt his supernatural sight expanding to accommodate new layers of perception. For the first time since his accident, he wasn't just seeing the world of the dead. He was beginning to understand the true scope of reality itself. Behind them, the door closed with a sound like distant thunder, sealing them into a world where the impossible was merely the starting point for something far more extraordinary. Clayton's first lesson in dimensional perception nearly drove him insane. "Professor," Sterling had placed him on one of the floating stone platforms in the impossible training room and instructed him to simply observe what lay beyond normal reality. What Clayton saw when he opened his supernatural sight to its fullest extent was a cascading series of worlds layered on top of each other like sheets of glass. Each one slightly different from the last dot in one layer. The training room was filled with students from decades past, learning the same techniques he was attempting to master. In another, the space was empty except for construction workers building the facility in what appeared to be the 1800s. Most disturbing of all was a layer where the room was dark and abandoned, with skeletal remains scattered across the platforms. Possible future he desperately hoped to avoid. Focus on one layer at a time, Sterling instructed, his voice somehow reaching Clayton across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Don't try to see everything at once or you'll lose yourself in the infinite. Clayton gritted his teeth and attempted to narrow his perception, but the effort felt like trying to hold back a flood with his bare hands. Information from dozens of dimensional layers crashed through his consciousness, conversations from the past, warnings from possible futures, and the constant presence of spirits who existed across multiple planes of reality. On a platform 50 feet away, Billy was undergoing his own trial. Professor Sterling had paired him with Agent Jennifer Chun, a department veteran whose ability to manipulate electromagnetic fields complemented Billy's conductivity perfectly. When Billy focused his power, Agent Chun's electrical attacks increased dramatically in both scope and precision. Remarkable, Sterling observed, making notes on a clipboard that appeared to be writing itself. Mr. Thompson, you're not just amplifying Agent Chun's abilities, you're refining them, making them more efficient and controlled. Billy looked exhausted but pleased with his progress. It feels like I'm completing a circuit that was already there, like her power was always meant to work this way. Sterling nodded approvingly. That's exactly what conductivity is, the ability to see the optimal patterns for supernatural energy and help others achieve them. It's why conductor-sensitive pairs are so effective in the field. Clayton tried to concentrate on the conversation, but a spirit from what appeared to be the Civil War era materialized beside him, pointing frantically toward one of the dimensional layers. Beware the man with silver eyes, the spirit warned. He comes for the conductor, 3 days hence when the moon is dark. Before Clayton could ask for clarification, the spirit vanished, leaving him struggling to maintain his focus on the dimensional viewing exercise. Mr. Marshall, Sterling called out, you seem distracted. What are you seeing? A warning, Clayton replied, finally managing to narrow his perception to just 2 or 3 dimensional layers. Something about a man with silver eyes coming for Billy. The effect of his words on the training room was immediate and dramatic. Every agent and instructor stopped what they were doing, and Clayton could sense supernatural energy levels spiking throughout the facility as defensive protocols activated automatically. Did the spirit specify when? Sterling asked, his casual demeanor replaced by urgent professionalism. 3 days when the moon is dark. Clayton checked the dimensional layers again, but the spirit had vanished completely. Why? Who is the man with silver eyes? Professor Sterling and Agent Chun exchanged grim looks. Thaddeus Grimm, Chun said quietly. One of the most dangerous supernatural criminals we've ever encountered. He specializes in capturing and enslaving people with rare abilities. Like conductors, Sterling added. Mr. Thompson, I'm afraid your training just became significantly more urgent. Within an hour, Camp Supernatural had transformed from a peaceful training facility into a fortress, preparing for siege. Clayton watched through the windows of Sterling's office as agents installed supernatural defensive systems around the perimeter, crystalline structures that hummed with otherworldly energy and cast shifting shadows that hurt to look at directly. Director Hawthorne burst into the office without knocking, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled urgency. "Professor, how certain are we about this warning?" "The spirit who delivered it has been dead for 60 years, Sterling replied. "Spirits that old rarely lie, and never about matters this serious. If he says Grimm is coming for Mr. Thompson, then we need to treat it as fact." "Sir," Clayton interjected, "maybe Billy and I should leave. If this Grimm person is after him specifically, wouldn't it be safer for everyone if we weren't here?" Hawthorne shook his head. "Grimm isn't the type to give up once he's identified a target. If we send you away, he'll simply follow. At least, here, we have defenses and enough firepower to put up a fight." Billy, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, finally spoke up. "What exactly does this Grimm want with me?" Sterling sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. "Thaddeus Grimm believes that conductor abilities can be extracted and transferred to other people. He's been experimenting with supernatural surgery for over a decade, trying to steal the gifts that people like you are born with." "Surgery?" Billy's face went pale. "Crude, brutal surgery that usually kills the victim," Agent Chun clarified. "Grimm doesn't care about preserving the person only, the ability." Clayton felt sick. "How many people has he?" 17 confirmed victims, Hawthorne said grimly. "All of them rare ability holders. Seers, telepaths, spirit mediums. Anyone with a gift that he thinks might enhance his own power." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent knocking at the office door. Agent Whitmore entered without waiting for permission, her face flushed from running. "Director," she said breathlessly, "we've got a problem. Grimm isn't waiting for the new moon. Our perimeter sensors just detected multiple supernatural signatures approaching from the east. He's coming now." Hawthorne was on his feet immediately. "How many?" "At least 6 distinct energy patterns, possibly more. And Sir, one of them is massive. Bigger than anything we've seen from Grimm before." Through the window, Clayton could see agents taking defensive positions around the facility. Some were setting up conventional weapons, while others prepared supernatural defenses, circles of salt and iron, protective wards carved into stone, and artifacts that glowed with protective energy. "Mr. Marshall, Mr. Thompson," Hawthorne said, "I want you both in the secure vault beneath the main building." "Professor Sterling will—" "No," Clayton interrupted, surprising everyone including himself. "Billy and I didn't join the department to hide in bunkers. If this Grimm wants a fight, we'll give him one." "You've had exactly 1 day of training," Agent Chun pointed out. "Grimm has been perfecting his abilities for over 20 years. "Maybe," Billy said, standing beside Clayton, "but he's never faced a resonant pair before. Sterling said we were rare. Let's show him why." Professor Sterling studied them both with those deep, otherworldly eyes. "It's incredibly dangerous. If you lose control of your abilities during combat, then we lose control," Clayton said firmly. "But at least we'll go down fighting instead of cowering." Hawthorne was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks. Finally he nodded. "Very well. But you stay with experienced agents at all times, and if I give the order to retreat, you retreat. Understood?" Before either of them could answer, the building shook as something massive struck the outer defensive perimeter. Through the windows, Clayton could see dark energy crackling against the facility's protective barriers like lightning striking. "A ship's mast. Positions, everyone," Hawthorne commanded. "This is what we've trained for." Clayton and Billy followed Agent Whitmore and Professor Sterling to the main courtyard, where the department's defensive line was forming. Clayton had never seen so many people with supernatural abilities gathered in one place, agents whose hands crackled with electricity, others who seemed to bend shadows to their will, and several who radiated pure light like miniature suns. "Remember," Sterling said as they took their positions, "you're not here to be heroes. Watch, learn, and only use your abilities if directly threatened." The first wave of Grimm's attack came from underground. The earth beneath the courtyard suddenly erupted as monstrous creatures emerged, things that might once have been human, but had been so twisted by dark magic that they barely resembled their original forms. The department agents responded with devastating efficiency. Beams of supernatural energy lanced through the air. Some creatures were frozen solid by agents who commanded ice and cold, while others were simply torn apart by telekinetic forces. But more kept coming. For every monster destroyed, 2 more emerged from the ground or materialized from the shadows. Clayton quickly realized that this was just a distraction. The real attack would come from elsewhere. His supernatural sight confirmed his suspicions. Through the dimensional layers, he could see a group of figures approaching the facility's main building from the north, moving with stealth that would have made them invisible to normal perception. "Professor," Clayton called out over the sounds of battle. "The main building. There's another group." His warning was cut off as something that looked like a cross between a wolf and a spider lunged at him from a tier in reality itself. Clayton threw himself backward, but the creature was faster than anything natural had a right to be. The monster never reached him. Billy stepped forward, and suddenly every supernatural ability within 50 feet was amplified beyond anything Clayton had thought possible. Agent Whitmore's light became a blazing inferno that incinerated the creature instantly, while Agent Chun's electromagnetic pulse short-circuited half a dozen other monsters simultaneously. "Incredible," Sterling breathed. "Mr. Thompson, you're not just conducting individual abilities, you're creating a network effect. Everyone's power is feeding off everyone else's." The amplified abilities turned the tide of the courtyard battle almost instantly, but Clayton's attention was focused on the main building. Through his dimensional sight, he could see the stealth team had reached the lower levels and was moving toward what appeared to be the facility's power source. "They're not here for Billy," Clayton realized with growing horror. "They're here to steal the facility's supernatural energy reserves. If they drain those, the defensive barriers will collapse," Professor Serling finished. "And every supernatural criminal we've ever captured will be free to escape." Hawthorne's voice crackled over the communication system. "All agents, priority target shift. Hostile infiltration team in sub-basement level 3. Converge immediately." But it was too late. The lights throughout the facility suddenly dimmed, and Clayton could feel the protective barriers beginning to weaken. Whatever Grimm's team was doing in the basement, it was working. "This way," Agent Whitmore commanded, leading Clayton and Billy toward a service entrance. "If we can reach the power core before they drain it completely. They were halfway across the courtyard when the real Thaddeus Grimm finally revealed himself. He appeared without warning in the center of the battle. A tall man with prematurely white hair and eyes that literally glowed with silver light. But it wasn't his appearance that made Clayton's blood run cold. It was what his supernatural sight revealed about the man's true nature. Grimm wasn't human anymore. His body was a patchwork of stolen abilities, each one glowing with the tortured essence of its original owner. Clayton could see the spirits of Grimm's victims bound within the man's flesh, their anguish fueling his unnatural power. "Agent Thompson," Grimm called out in a voice that seemed to come from multiple throats simultaneously, "I've come to offer you a choice. Surrender yourself willingly, and I'll allow your friends to live. Force me to take you by violence, and everyone in this facility dies." Billy stepped forward, his face set with determination. "Here's my counteroffer. Go to hell." Grimm smiled, revealing teeth that had been replaced with what appeared to be crystallized supernatural energy. "I was hoping you'd say that." What happened next would be remembered as the Battle of Camp Supernatural, a confrontation that would reshape the department's understanding of what was possible when supernatural abilities were pushed beyond their normal limits. Clayton felt Billy's conductor ability surge to levels that should have been impossible, amplifying not just the powers of nearby agents, but somehow reaching across the dimensional layers to draw energy from alternative versions of themselves. For the first time since removing his burlap sack in Millbrook, Clayton Marshall was about to discover just how powerful he and his partner could become when they stopped holding back. The moment Billy unleashed his full conductor ability, reality itself seemed to bend around Camp Supernatural. Clayton's dimensional sight exploded outward. No longer limited to seeing through layers of existence, he was pulling power from them, drawing strength from alternate versions of himself across infinite possibilities. Thaddeus Grimm's silver eyes widened with genuine surprise as the combined force of Clayton and Billy's resonant abilities created a supernatural storm that dwarfed anything he'd encountered in 2 decades of stealing power from others. "Impossible," Grimm snarled, his patchwork body crackling with the stolen essences of his victims. "No untrained pair should be capable of." His words were cut off as Agent Whitmore, empowered by Billy's amplification field, launched a beam of light so intense it carved a canyon through the courtyard's stone flooring. The attack missed Grimm by inches, but the sheer power behind it sent shockwaves through the dimensional fabric. Clayton could see the battle playing out across multiple reality layers simultaneously. In some versions, they were losing Grimm's superior experience and stolen abilities overwhelming the facility's defenses. But in others, their resonant partnership was creating possibilities that had never existed before. "Billy," Clayton called out, "can you feel it? The other versions of us, they're fighting the same battle. If we can coordinate with them." "I can try," Billy replied, sweat beading on his forehead from the effort of maintaining such massive amplification. "But I don't know how long I can hold this level of power." Professor Sterling appeared beside them, his own abilities enhanced by Billy's field to the point where he seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Mr. Marshall, what you're suggesting is theoretical at best. Cross-dimensional coordination has never been attempted during active combat." "Then we'd better learn fast," Clayton said, watching as Grimm began summoning more creatures from tiers in reality. "Because I don't think conventional tactics are going to stop him." Across the courtyard, Director Hawthorne was coordinating the department's response with military precision. Teams of agents were systematically destroying Grimm's summoned monsters, while others worked to restore the facility's power core. But Clayton could see through his dimensional sight that none of it would matter if they couldn't stop Grimm himself. The stolen essences within Grimm's body were growing stronger, feeding off the chaos of battle. Each agent that fell to his creatures seemed to make him more powerful, and Clayton realized with growing horror that the entire attack had been designed to create exactly this kind of supernatural feeding frenzy. "He's not just here for you," Clayton told Billy. "He's here to harvest power from everyone in the facility. The more chaos he creates, the stronger he becomes." "Then we stop the chaos," Billy said with grim determination. "Professor, I need you to coordinate with the other agents. If everyone focuses their abilities through me at exactly the same moment, the feedback could kill you," Sterling warned. "No conductor has ever attempted to channel that many different power sources simultaneously." "No conductor has ever had Clayton as a partner," Billy replied. "His dimensional sight can guide the energy flows, keep them from overwhelming my system." Clayton felt a chill of fear mixed with anticipation. What Billy was proposing was beyond dangerous, it was potentially suicidal. But looking around at the devastation Grimm was causing, he realized they might not have any other choice. "Do it," he said. Sterling nodded grimly and began sending telepathic instructions to every agent in the facility. Within moments, Clayton could see supernatural energies beginning to converge on their position from all directions. Light wielders like Agent Whitmore, electromagnetic manipulators like Agent Chun, telekinetics, pyrokinetics, and dozens of others with abilities Clayton couldn't even identify. But as the power began flowing through Billy, Clayton realized they'd made a critical error. The young carpenter's conductor ability was designed to amplify and refine supernatural energies, not contain them. The sheer volume of power coursing through him was already pushing his body beyond its limits. "Billy, you need to release some of the energy, or—" "I know," Billy gasped, his entire body now glowing with accumulated power. "But where? If I just blast it at Grimm, he'll absorb it and become even stronger." That's when Clayton remembered the spirits bound within Grimm's stolen body, the tortured essences of everyone he'd murdered and mutilated. Through his dimensional sight, Clayton could see them clearly now, trapped in a hellish existence as fuel for their killer's power. "The victims," Clayton said suddenly. "Billy, you need to channel the energy to them, not to Grimm. If we can free the spirits, he's enslaved. Double quotes understanding dawned in Billy's eyes. Instead of launching the accumulated power at Grimm directly, he began weaving it into threads of pure, supernatural energy that reached toward the bound spirits within their captor's body. The effect was immediate and dramatic. One by one, the stolen essences began breaking free from Grimm's control, their liberation causing his power to fluctuate wildly. The first spirit to escape was a young woman with the same kind of conductor ability Billy possessed, and the moment she was freed, she added her own power to his amplification field. "No!" Grimm roared, his silver eyes blazing with fury as more spirits broke free. "They belong to me. Their power is mine by right of conquest." But it was too late. The chain reaction had begun, and each liberated spirit weakened Grimm, while simultaneously strengthening the resonant field between Clayton and Billy. Soon, dozens of freed souls were working together, their combined abilities creating a supernatural harmony that made the air itself sing with power. Grimm, realizing his advantage was slipping away, made a desperate gambit. He reached into a dimensional tier and pulled forth something that made Clayton's enhanced sight reel in horror. A creature from the deepest layers of supernatural reality, something that had never been human and never should have existed in the physical world. The entity that emerged was pure predatory hunger given form, a writhing mass of shadow and teeth that began devouring the supernatural energy around it indiscriminately. Agent after agent fell as the creature consumed their life force, and even the liberated spirits began to fade as it fed. "It's a void spawn," Professor Sterling said, his voice filled with genuine terror. "Grimm's pulled something from the space between dimensions. If we can't stop it, it'll consume everything with supernatural power," Clayton finished, "including everyone in this facility." The creature was growing larger with each feeding, and Clayton could see through his dimensional sight that it was already beginning to affect alternate reality layers. If it continued to grow, it would eventually devour supernatural energy across multiple dimensions. "Billy," Clayton said, making a decision that he knew would change both their lives forever, "we need to go full resonance. Not just amplifying each other's abilities, actually merging them." Billy looked at him with understanding and acceptance. "That's never been done before. We don't know if we'd be able to separate afterward." "Maybe we won't," Clayton admitted. "But if we don't try, there won't be an afterward for anyone." Around them, the battle had devolved into chaos as the void spawn continued its relentless feeding. Even Director Hawthorne's most powerful agents were falling back, their attacks having no effect on a creature that existed primarily in the spaces between realities. Clayton and Billy joined hands in the center of the courtyard, their combined abilities creating a pillar of light that reached up into the sky and down through the dimensional layers. Clayton could feel Billy's consciousness merging with his own, their separate identities beginning to blur as their supernatural gifts combined in ways that defied all known theories. Together, they reached across the dimensional barriers and made contact with every version of themselves that existed across infinite realities. Thousands of Clayton Marshalls and Billy Thompsons, all fighting the same battle in slightly different circumstances, all lending their power to this crucial moment. The merged consciousness that was both Clayton and Billy began to reshape reality itself around the void spawn, creating a dimensional cage that existed across multiple layers of existence simultaneously. The creature thrashed against its prison, but for the first time since its summoning, it was unable to feed. Grim, seeing his ultimate weapon contained, made one final attempt to escape. But the liberated spirits of his victims had other plans. Led by the conductor spirit who'd been the first to break free, they surrounded their former captor and began the process of justice that had been denied them for so long. "Thaddeus Grimm," spoke a collective voice made up of all his victims. "You stand accused of murder, mutilation, and the enslavement of souls. How do you answer?" Grimm's silver eyes darted frantically around the courtyard, looking for any avenue of escape. Finding none, his facade of confidence finally cracked completely. "I was saving them," he screamed. "Their abilities would have been wasted on mundane lives. I gave them purpose. You gave them death," the spirits replied in unison. "And now we give you judgment." What happened next was swift and final. The liberated spirits didn't attack Grimm physically. Instead, they simply withdrew their power from him completely. Without the stolen essences to sustain his unnatural existence, Grimm's body began to age rapidly, decades of borrowed time catching up to him in moments. He collapsed to the courtyard stones, his silver eyes fading to ordinary gray as his consciousness scattered like smoke in the wind. The man who had terrorized supernatural communities across the continent was gone, leaving only the withered husk of what he'd once been. The void spawn, deprived of its summoner's power, began to fade back into the dimensional void from which it had emerged. Clayton and Billy maintained their merged consciousness just long enough to ensure the creature was completely banished, then slowly began the delicate process of separating their combined awareness. It was like pulling apart two pieces of a puzzle that had been fused together, possible, but requiring extraordinary care to avoid damaging either piece. When they finally opened their individual eyes again, both men were forever changed by the experience of sharing a single consciousness. "Are you you?" Clayton asked Billy uncertainly. "I think so," Billy replied, though his voice carried overtones that hadn't been there before. "Though I'm definitely not the same person I was this morning." Professor Sterling approached them with a mixture of awe and concern. "Gentlemen, what you just accomplished should have been impossible. Merging consciousness across dimensional barriers, coordinating with alternate versions of yourselves, creating a stable prison for a void spawn. Any one of those feats would have been considered theoretical at best." Director Hawthorne joined them, his usually composed demeanor replaced by something approaching wonder. "The department has been studying supernatural abilities for over a century, and we've never seen anything like what you two just demonstrated." Around the courtyard, the cleanup was already beginning. The liberated spirits were fading peacefully into whatever came after death, finally free to continue their interrupted journeys. The damaged buildings were being repaired by agents with reality manipulation abilities, and the wounded were receiving treatment from department medics. "What happens now?" Clayton asked. "Now," Hawthorne said, "you finish your training and join the department as full agents. Though I suspect your assignment priorities just shifted significantly. There are supernatural threats out there that only your combined abilities can handle." "Agent." Whitmore approached with a satisfied smile. "I hate to interrupt, but there's something you should see." She led them to the facility's main communication center, where displays showed department operations across the country. "Grimm's network is collapsing," she explained. "With his death, every supernatural criminal he was connected to has lost their primary source of stolen power. Our field teams are reporting mass surrenders and easy captures across 7 states. Clayton felt a deep satisfaction watching as red markers on the map, representing active supernatural threats, began turning green one by one. Each color change represented lives saved, victims freed, and justice finally served. But more than that, it represented something he'd never thought possible when he first wrapped that burlap sack around his head months ago. His curse had become his calling, his burden had become his strength, and his isolation had led him to the greatest partnership of his life. Billy nudged him with an elbow. "So, partner, ready for the next case?" Clayton looked around at the department agents, working with quiet efficiency to restore order, at the dimensional barriers that protected innocent people from supernatural threats, and at the communication displays showing successful operations around the country. He thought about all the spirits who'd found peace through their intervention, and all the future victims they'd prevented through their actions. For the first time since his accident, Clayton Marshall could honestly say he was grateful for the supernatural sight that had initially seemed like such a terrible burden. The burlap sack was gone forever, but more importantly, so was the shame and fear that had driven him to hide from the world. "Ready," he said, and meant it completely. As the sun set over the hidden valley of Camp Supernatural, Clayton and Billy stood on the observation deck of the main building, looking out over a facility that was already returning to its normal operations. New students were arriving for training, experienced agents were preparing for missions around the world, and the work of protecting humanity from supernatural threats continued without pause. They were no longer the frightened, desperate men who'd stumbled into Millbrook weeks ago. They were federal agents with abilities that could reshape reality itself, partners in the truest sense of the word, and guardians of a secret world that most people would never know existed. And somewhere in the vast scope of infinite dimensions, Clayton could sense other versions of themselves taking their first steps into this same extraordinary life, each one choosing courage over fear, partnership over isolation, and hope over despair. The blind cowboy who'd hidden his face from the world was gone. In his place stood someone who saw more clearly than he ever had before, ready to face whatever supernatural threats tomorrow might bring. After all, he wasn't alone anymore. He never would be again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.